From Castle Rexworth and the Rexworth Estates, I bid you good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are and whenever you are. My name is Rexworth, Lord Rexworth, and I welcome you to Friday night here at Castle Rexworth. Going to be continuing our reading ASMR of The Saint by Leslie Charteris. Plan to go for at least 2 hours, and I have come prepared this time. I was a bit underprepared last time. I was a rather naughty boy in that regard. But this time, I am prepared. I have 2 bottles of water here at the ready. 2 hours reading, yes. Good meadow, good sir. Hey, Kogane. Hazy, welcome in. And Raimi, of course, welcome to you as well. Time to trim the roses. Indeed. Indeed. I've got 2 bottles of water with me, and I've also got an ice shaker cup full of the first sponsor for tonight, which we can go ahead and get that out of the way. Not that we're not glad to have them here or anything, but yes, His Lordship, powered by Dubby. I know I'm going to have to put in another order for Dubby fairly soon, because I just ran out of the my last bit of Dubby. It's here in the shaker cup, and it's a bit strong because I just dumped out the last tiny little bit of like a spoonful of it. But anyways, what is Dubby, you might ask? Well, it's an energy drink that you can mix at home with no jitters, no crash, and it's made from green coffee extract. It's really something special. W was formulated to give you focus and energy with no jitters or crash, and the formula contains vitamins, amino acids, and nootropics, including the patented neurofactor. W contains no calories, no sugar, no maltodextrin, no fillers, and no artificial colors. It's made by professionals in the United States in an FDA-registered and inspected facility, strictly adhering to GMP guidelines. When raw ingredients arrive at the facility, they undergo a quarantine, where a small sample of each ingredient is taken to test for any impurities, and it's also tested through spectroscopic analysis to ensure that ingredients are actually what they are supposed to be and they are the proper dosage. And only once those ingredients pass all the tests, they're then cleared to begin getting mixed into their formulas, which is transparently disclosed on their label. The legitimacy and accuracy of their product is very important to them, and it's also important to me as well. Otherwise, I wouldn't drink it. I would have recommended to any of you. All the steps of the process of creating Dubby are handled by trained professionals. So try Dubby today. Go to dubby.gg or click that link in chat and use the code Lord Rexworth, all one word, at checkout. That's Lord Rexworth, all one word, for 10% off your order by going to dubby.gg or clicking that link in chat. They've got some fantastic flavors to choose from. I just finished up the Calio cream flavor. Absolutely delicious. It's a blend of mango and orange and cream. They've also got Push and Punch, which is, if you like Sprite or 7-Up, for example, and perhaps you like a fruit punch flavor, well, mix them together and there you have it. You've got what Push and Punch might taste like. There's also the flavors. There's 4 of them that are available in a starter sampler pack. Beach and Peach, which is mango white peach. The Dub Sludge, which is Granny Smith apple and secret sauce. Galaxy Grenade, which is a blend of watermelon, guava, and lime. And then there's Dragonade, which is dragon fruit and pink strawberry lemonade. Sounds delicious. I want cranberry. Well, go to dubby.gg and let them know about that. I'll also take a note down to say, hey, Dubby, come up with a cranberry flavor, especially for my dear noble Kagane. I'm sure they can make something happen. Surely they can do something like that. Oh, there's also another one called Big Energy Tears, which is a blue raspberry flavor. Sounds absolutely delicious. If you're not sure which flavor you like, get the starter sampler pack. It's only $12.49. It even comes with a sports shaker cup. Really durable looking thing, designed to take a beating and still hold the liquid in there and keep things fresh and cool for you. So try Dubby today. Use the code Lord Rexworth at checkout for 10% off your order by going to dubby.gg. That's dubby.gg, code Lord Rexworth at checkout, 10% off your order. Dubby, be better. And then we're also brought to you tonight by Wise. Open a Wise account now by clicking that link in the chat. What is Wise? Well, most people, whenever they're traveling, especially with international travel picking up after so many years, most people are running into the issue of hefty conversion fees, foreign transaction fees, ATM charges when traveling. Most American banks, they'll charge about 3% on every foreign transaction. That's madness. It's absolute madness. And it's bad enough that somebody might take advantage of you if you're a foreigner in a foreign country, but we don't need your bank at home doing the same thing. The Wise multi-currency account and debit card help to solve that problem. You can convert money before the trip at mid-market exchange rates plus a small upfront fee. Then when you reach your travel destination, you simply pay with your Wise debit card or withdraw at ATMs, and you get free withdrawals up to $250 each month. And best of all, with the Wise debit card, there are no foreign transaction fees. So, when traveling abroad, consider Wise. With their multi-currency account and debit card, you can spend and withdraw money in over 40 currencies from local ATMs. It's much cheaper than using your local bank. Click the link there in chat to open your Wise account today. Wise up, my dear nobles, with Wise. And then we're also brought to you by the Cash App. Try the Cash App today. It's free to download on iOS and Android devices using my code. Just click that link there in chat. We'll both get $5 when you link a new bank account and send $5. It's as easy as that. Just click the link there to download the Cash App and get that set up. Send and receive money the smart way with the Cash App. Now, with all of that out of the way, let me go ahead and plug the links here. Everything's available at lordrexworth.com. You see that on the screen up there in the top left, lordrexworth.com. Also got the Throne Shop. You can support his lordship through purchases at the Throne Shop, lordrexworth.store. That's lordrexworth.store. And of course, I've got the regular Throne page. Gifts always appreciated, but never required by his lordship. You can check out the Throne page at throne.com/Lord Rexworth. Do give me a follow on the Twitter page, twitter.com/Lord Rexworth, or just search at Lord Rexworth whenever you get over to Twitter X. Let's see, and if you haven't joined the Discord, well, what are you waiting for? The gates are open, so join the Castle Rexworth Discord today by clicking the link in chat. And then, of course, I know there was something else that I wanted to plug. Oh, yes. The tip jar's out. You can support his lordship directly with a donation via Stream Elements. Just go to streamelements.com/Lord Rexworth/tip, or just click that link in chat. I think that's everything out of the way. And did it in record time, about less than 5 minutes for all that. And that was more entertaining than an ad break, I dare say. Looking at my tracking here. Hang on. There we are. Yeah, that's better. I think. Yeah. We're good. All good. I think. Looking at my tracking on the model, and the mouth is looking a bit I'm looking a bit weak with the mouth here tonight. That's interesting. Hang on. Easy solution to that. There we are. Yes, that's better. All right, much more responsive this time. That's good. All right. Great. Well, without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started with our reading ASMR. We had been reading a story by Leslie Charteris about a character known as the Saint. If you've never seen the Saint, I would suggest that you do a Google search for that, and you will actually find that there's on Amazon Prime, at least in North America, there is a let me take this cover off here. I may have to recalibrate my model later on. Anyways, there's a TV show that was released by ITV in the UK and then all around the world in the 1960s called The Saint, and it starred a young Sir Roger Moore as Simon Templar. A man who is reformed, master thief and criminal who goes around helping other people. Wait a minute. What? Wait a minute, what? What's the matter, Kagane? What's the matter? What are we waiting a minute for? What are the beans? What the beans? What kind of beans? Everyone knows beans means Heinz. Don't mind me too much. Oh? Well, all right then. Anyway, we would, let's see, what is the name of this story that we were working on? Got it right here. We're up to the 9th chapter. Ah, yes, the Medical Tea Party. So, one of the foils for the saint, an Inspector Claude Eustace Teal, he had stumbled upon what appeared to be a type of money laundering scam going on at a local drugstore, a local pharmacy there in London. And it also caught the attention of the saint at the same time. And so the saint is now undercover at the pharmacist at the drugstore, and he is he's trying to uncover the entire plot and put an end to it. So off we go with the 9th chapter. The simple beauty of the system made his pulses skip. Plans like that could be passed over in the guise of prescriptions, boodle, cash payments for services rendered, or almost anything else could be handed over the counter, enclosed in tubes of cold cream or packets of medical tea. And it could all be done openly and with impunity, even while other genuine customers were in the shop waiting to be served. Even if the man who did it were suspected under surveillance, the same transactions could take place countless times under the very eyes of a watcher, and be dismissed as an entirely unimportant feature of the suspect's daily activities. Short of deliberate betrayal, it left no loophole through which Osbert himself could be involved at all, and even that risk, with a little ingenuity, could probably be manipulated so as to leave someone like the shifty-eyed young assistant to hold the baby. It was foolproof and puncture-proof, except against such an unforeseen train of accidents as had delivered one fatal package of medical tea into Chief Inspector Teal's unwitting paws and tumbled it from his pocket into Simon Templar's car. The one vast and monumental question mark that was left was wrapped all the way round the mystery of what was the motive focus of the whole machinery. A highly organized and up-to-date gang of thieves directed by a mastermind and operating with the efficiency of a big business? The answer seemed trite but possible. And yet, all the goods he could see round him were probably as genuine as patent slimming salts and mouthwashes can be. Any special packages would certainly be kept aside. And there was nothing noticeably out of place at that time. He examined the cash register. It contained nothing but a small amount of money, which he transferred to a hospital collecting box on the counter. The ancient notes and invoices and prescriptions spread onto hook files in the dispensing compartment were obviously innocuous. Nothing incriminating was likely to be left lying about there. The first brisk spell of trade seemed to have fallen off, and no one else had entered the shop since the visit of Weaselface. Simon went back upstairs and investigated the room into which he had dodged when he followed the shifty-eyed youth up the stairs. He remembered it as having had an air of a storeroom of some kind, and he was right. It contained large jars, packing cases, and cardboard cartons, labeled with assorted names and cryptic signs, some of them prosaically familiar, stacked about in not particularly methodical piles. But the whole rear half of the room, in contrasting orderliness, was stacked from floor to ceiling with mounds of small yellow packages that he could recognize at a glance. He looked round again, and on one wall he found in a cheap frame the official certificate which announced to all whom it might concern that Mr. Henry Osbert had dutifully complied with the law and registered the fact that he was trading under the business name of the Medical Tea Company. "Well, well, well," said the saint dreamily. "What a small world it is after all." He fished out his cigarette case and smoked part of the way through a cigarette while he stood gazing abstractedly over the unilluminating contents of the room. and his brain was a whirlpool of new and startling questions. Leo von Clark, thank you so much for the follow. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Welcome in, welcome in. And with that, Leo, I thank you so much. We have met our follow goal of 180 nobles. So that is something to celebrate there, my friends. Thank you so much. Thank you, Leo. Thank you, thank you. Hopefully the Among Us collab is going well. We're going to be raiding into Project Astadia's one of the Project Astadia streams later on and joining them in progress with a big collab of Among Us. Now let's see, where were we? Then he pulled himself together and went back to the office. The three men he had left there were all awake again by then, and squirming ineffectually. Simon shook his head at them. "Relax, boys," he said smoothly. "You're only wearing yourselves out, and think what a mess you're making of your clothes." Their swollen eyes glared at him mutely, with three individual renderings of hate and malevolence intensified by different degrees of fear. But if the saint had been susceptible to the cremating power of the human eye, he would have been a walking cinder many years ago. Calmly, he proceeded to empty their pockets and examine every scrap of paper he found on them. But except for a driving license which gave him Mr. Nancock's name and address in Croydon, he was no wiser when he had finished. After that, he turned his attention to the filing cabinet, but as far as a lengthy search could tell, it contained nothing but a conventional collection of correspondence on harmless matters concerned with the legitimate business of the shop and the marketing of miracle tea. He sat down in Mr. Osbert's swivel chair and went systematically through the drawers of the desk, but they also provided him with no enlightenment. The net result of his labors was a magnificent and symmetrically rounded 0. The saint's face showed no hint of his disappointment. He sat for a few seconds longer, tilting himself gently back and forth, and then he stood up. "It's a pity you don't keep more money on the premises, Henry," he remarked. "You could have saved yourself a stamp." He picked up a paper knife from the desk and tested the blade with his thumb. It was sharp enough. The eyes of the bound men dilated as they watched him. The saint smiled. "From the way you were talking when I first came in, it looks as if you know my business," he said. "And I hope you've realized by this time that I know yours. It isn't a very nice business. But that's something for you to worry about. All I'm concerned with is to make sure that you pay the proper luxury tax to the right person, which just so happens to be me. So, will you attend to it as soon as possible, Henry? I should think that about £10,000 shall do for a first installment. I shall expect it in £1 notes, delivered by messenger before 2:30 p.m. tomorrow. It better not be late." The saint's blue eyes were as friendly as frozen vitriol. "Because if it is, Chief Inspector Teal will be calling here again, and next time it won't be an accident. Meanwhile," the knife spun from his hands like a whirling white flame, and the three men flinched wildly as the point buried itself with a thud in the small space of carpet centrally between them. "If one of you gets to work with that, you ought to be up and again in about a few minutes. Goodbye, girls. Help yourself to some sal volatile when you get downstairs." It was nearly 1 o'clock by his watch when he reached the street, and Patricia was ordering herself a second martini when he strolled into the cocktail room at Quaglino's. She leaned back and closed her eyes. "I know," she said. "Teal and the flying squad are about 2 blocks behind you. I can tell by the smug look on your face." "For once in your life, you're wrong," he said as he lowered himself into a chair. "They're so far behind that if Einstein's right, they ought to have been here an hour ago." Over lunch, he gave an account of his morning. "But what is it all about?" she said. He frowned. "I just wish I knew, darling, but it's something bigger than burglary. You can take bets on that. If Henry Osbert is the mythical teapot in person, the plot is getting so thick you could float rocks on it. If I haven't got mixed on what Claude Eustace told me last night, they run a radio program, and that costs plenty of dough and trouble. No gang of burglars would bother to go so far as that, even to keep up appearances. Therefore, this is some racket in which the dough flows like water. Wish I could think what that could be. And it's run by experts. In the whole of that shop there isn't a single clue. I'll swear that Claude Eustace himself could put it through a sieve and not find anything. I was just bluffing Henry, of course, but I think I made a good job of it." "You don't think he'll pay, do you?" "Stranger things have happened," said the saint hopefully. "But if you put it like that, no, that was just bait. There wasn't anything else useful that I could do. If I'd had him somewhere else, I might have beaten it out of them, but I couldn't do it there, and I couldn't put him in a bag and bring him home with me. Anyhow, this may be a better way. It means that the next move is up to the ungodly, and they've got to make it fast. And that may give us our break. Of course it may, she agreed politely. By the way, where did you tell me once you wanted to be buried? He chuckled. Under the foundation stone of a brewery, he said, but don't worry, I'm going to take a lot of care of myself. His idea of taking care of himself for that afternoon was to drive the Hirondelle down to the factory at an average speed of about 60 miles an hour to discuss the installation of a new type of supercharger designed to make the engine several degrees more lethal than it was already, and afterwards to drive back to London at a slightly higher speed in order to be punctual for his appointment with Mr. Teal. Considering that ride in retrospect, he sometimes wondered whether he would have any chance of claiming that the astounding quality of care which it showed could be credited entirely to his own inspired forethought. It was on the stroke of 4 when he sailed into the Mayfair and espied the plump and unromantic shape of Chief Inspector Teal, dumped into a pink brocade armchair and looking rather like a bailiff in a boudoir. Teal got up as the Saint breezed toward him, and something in the way he straightened and stood there almost checked Simon in the middle of a stride. Simon forced himself to keep coming without a flaw on the smooth surface of his outward tranquility, but a sixth sense was rocketing red danger signals through his brain even before he heard the detective's unnaturally hard, gritty voice. "I've been waiting for you, Saint." "Then you must have been early, Claude," said the Saint. His smile was amiable and unruffled, but there was an outlaw's watchfulness at the back of his bantering eyes. "Not any excuse for the basilisk leer. Anyone would think you've been eating." "I don't want to hear any more of that," Teal said crunchily. "You know damn well why I'm waiting for you. Do you know what this is?" He flourished a piece of paper in Simon's face. The Saint raised his eyebrows. "Oh, not another of those jolly old warrants," he murmured. "You must be getting quite a collection of them." "I'm not going to need to collect any more," Teal said grimly. "You went too far when you left your mark on the dead man you threw out of your car in Richmond Park this afternoon. I'm taking you into custody on a charge of willful murder." Malachi, welcome in. Hey, buddy, can't stay long. Just wanted to say hi. Well, hello. Glad to see you, Malachi. And I hope you're having a good day. I hope you have a wonderful weekend planned. But thank you so much for stopping by. And feel free to lurk as long as you like. It's always appreciated. Chapter 10. Simon took Mr. Teal by the arm and led him back to a seat. He was probably the only man in the world who could have got away with such a thing, but he did it without the faintest sign of effort. He switched on about 50,000 watts of his personality, and Mr. Teal was sitting down beside him before he recovered from it. "Damn it, Templar, what the hell do you think you're doing?" he exploded wrathfully. "You're under arrest." "All right, I'm under arrest," said the Saint accommodatingly, as he stretched out his long legs. "So what?" "I'm taking you into custody." "Well, you said that before, but why the hurry? It isn't early closing day at Vine Street, is it? Let's have a tea first, and you can tell me all about this bird I'm supposed to have moided. You say it was thrown out of a car. Your Hirondelle. But why mine? After all, there are others. I don't use enough of them to keep the factory going by myself." The detective's jaws clamped on his chewing gum. "You can say all that to the magistrate in the morning," he retorted dourly. "It isn't my job to listen to you. It's my job to take you to the nearest police station and leave you there. And that's what I'm going to do. I've got a car and a couple of men at each of the entrances, so you better not give any trouble. I had an idea you'd be here at 4 o'clock. So I spend the afternoon moidering people and chucking them out of cars and then rush off to meet you, so you needn't even have the trouble of looking for me. I even use my own famous Hirondelle so that any cop can identify it. And I put my trademark on the deceased to make everything easy for the prosecution. You know, Claude," said the Saint pensively, "there are times when I wonder whether I'm quite sane." Teal's baby blue eyes clung to him balefully. "Go on," he grated. "Let's hear the new alibi. It'll give me plenty of time to get it torn down before you come up for trial." "Give me a chance," Simon protested. "I don't even know what time I'm supposed to have been doing all these exciting things." "You know perfectly well. Never mind. You tell me and let's see if we agree. What time did I sling this stiff out of my car?" "A few minutes after 3. He was only killed a few minutes before that." The Saint opened his cigarette case. "Well, that rather tears it," he said slowly, and Teal's eyes kindled with triumph. "So you weren't quite so smart." "Oh, no," said the Saint diffidently. "I was just thinking of it from your point of view. You see, just at that time, I was at the Hirondelle factory at Staines talking about a new blower I'm thinking of having glued onto the old buzz wagon. We've had quite a conference over it. There was the works manager, the service manager, and the shop foreman, and a couple of mechanics thrown in, so far as I remember. Of course, everybody knows that the whole staff down there is in my pay, but the only thing I'm worried about is whether you'll be able to make a jury believe it." A queerly childish contraction warped itself across Mr. Teal's rubicund features. He looked as if he had been suddenly seized with an acute pain below the belt. He was about to burst into tears. Both of these diagnoses contained an element of truth, but they were far from telling the whole story. The whole story went so far as to be compressed into a space less than volumes. It went far back into the days when Mr. Teal had been a competent and contented and commonplace detective, adequately doing a job in which miracles did not happen, and the natural laws of the universe were respected, and cast-iron cases were not being perennially disintegrated under his nose by a bland and tantalizing buccaneer whose elusiveness had almost started to convince him of the reality of black magic. It coiled through an infinite history of incredible disasters and hair-breadth frustrations that would have wrung the withers of anything softer than a marble statue. It belonged to the hysterical saga of his whole hopeless duel with the saint. Mr. Teal did not burst into tears, nor on this one unprecedented occasion did he choke over his gun while a flush of apoplectic fury boiled into his round face. Perhaps there were no more such reactions left in him, or perhaps on this one occasion an inescapable foreboding of the uselessness of it all strangled the spasm before it could mature and give him the supernatural strength to stifle his emotions under the pose of stolid somnolence that he could so rarely preserve against the saint's fiendishly shrewd attack. But however he achieved the feat, he managed to sit quite still while his hot, resentful eyes bored into the saint's smiling face for a time, before he struggled slothfully to his feet. "Wait a minute," he said thickly. He went over and spoke to a tall, cadaverous man who was hovering in the background. Then he came back and sat down again. Simon trickled an impudent stream of smoke towards him. "If I were a sensitive man, I should be offended, Claude. You have to be quite so obvious about it when you send Sergeant Barrow to find out whether I'm telling you the truth. It isn't good manners, comrade. It savours of distrust." Mr. Teal said nothing. He sat champing soporifically, staring steadfastly at the polished toes of his regulation boots until Sergeant Barrow returned. "Despite the one slight stumble, I'm in awe of your diction, superb. Believe me, this is not easy. This is, Leslie Charteris liked to show off a lot. He liked to, he had a way with words, and he definitely liked to let everyone else know it. So this is not an easy read, I assure you, especially for modern literature. And this does fall under modern literature, being it was from the 20th century and all. I can tell this is quite the tongue twister. Yes, I'm going to do some mouth exercises here and stretch my mouth out. Teal got up and spoke to him at a little distance, and when he rejoined the saint, the drowsiness was turgid and treacle-thick on his pink full-moon face. "All right," he bit out in a cracked voice, through his lips that were stiff and clumsy with the bitterness of defeat. "Now I suppose you tell me how you did it." "But I didn't do it, Claude," said the saint, with a seriousness that edged through his veneer of nonchalance. "I'm as keen as you are to get a line on this low criminal who takes my trademark in vain. Who is the bloke they picked up this afternoon?" For some reason which was beyond his understanding, the detective stopped short on the brink of a sarcastic comeback. "He was an Admiralty drossman by the name of Nancock," he said, and the gauzy derision on the saint's glance faded out abruptly as he realized that, in that simple answer, he had been given the secret of Mr. Osbert's remarkable chemistry. Chapter 11. It was as if a distorting mirror had been suddenly flattened out, so that it reflected a complete picture with brilliant and lifelike accuracy. The figures in it moved like marionettes. Simon even knew why Nancock had died. He himself, ironically for Teal's disappointment, had sealed the fat man's death warrant without even knowing it. Nancock was the man for whom the 1,500-pound packet of medical tea had been intended. Nancock had been making a fuss at the shop when the saint arrived. The fuss was due to nothing but Nancock's fright and greed, but to suspicious eyes, it might just as well have looked like the overdone attempt of a guilty conscience to establish its own innocence. Nancock's money had passed into the saint's hands. The saint had got into the shop on the pretext of bringing the same package back, and the saint had said, "I know all about your business." Simon could hear his own voice saying it. Osbert had made from that the one obvious deduction. Nancock had been a dead man when the saint left the shop. And to dump the body out of a hirondelle with a saint drawing pinned to it was a no less obvious reply. Probably they had used one of his own authentic drawings, which had still been lying on the desk when he left them. He might have been doing any one of a dozen things that afternoon, which would have left him without an alibi. He had told Patricia that the next move was up to the ungodly, and it had come faster than he had expected. But it had also fulfilled all of his other hopes. "Claude," he said softly, how would you like to make the whole of a lifetime?" Teal sat and looked at him. "I'll trade it," said the saint, "for something that will hardly give you any trouble at all. I was thinking of asking you to do it for me anyhow in return for saving your life last night. There are certain reasons why I want to know the address where they have a telephone number, Berkeley 3100. I can't get the information from the telephone company myself, but you can. I'll write it down for you." He scribbled the figures on a piece of paper. "Let me know where that number lives, and I'll give you your murderer and a lot more." Teal blinked suspiciously at the memorandum. "What's this got to do with it?" he demanded. "Nothing at all," said the saint untruthfully. "So don't waste your time sleuthing around the place and trying to pick up clues. It's just some private business of my own. Is it a sale?" The detective's eyes hardened. "Then you do know something about all this." "Maybe I'm just guessing. I'll be able to tell you later. For once in your life, will you let me do you a good turn without trying to argue me out of it?" Mr. Teal fought with himself, and for no reason that he could afterwards justify to himself, he said grudgingly, "All right, where shall I find you?" "I'll stay home till I hear from you." Simon stood up, and suddenly remembered for the first time why he was there at all. He pulled a yellow package out of his pocket and dropped it in the detective's lap. "Oh, yes, and don't forget to take some of this belly balm as soon as you get the chance. It may help you get back that sweet disposition you used to have, and stop you being so ready to think unkind thoughts about me." On the way home, he had a few qualms about the ultimate wisdom of that parting gesture, but his brain was too busy to dwell on them. The final patterns of the adventure were swinging into place with the regimented precision that always seemed to come to his episodes after the most chaotic beginnings, and the rhythm of it was like wine in his blood. He had made Teal drive slowly past Cornwall House with him in a police car, in case there were any watchers waiting to see whether the attempt to saddle him with Nancock's murder would be successful. From Cannon Row Police Station, which is also a rear exit from Scotland Yard, he took a taxi back to his apartment, and stopped at a newsagent's on the way to buy a copy of a certain periodical in which he had hitherto taken little interest. By the time he got home, it had given him the information that he wanted. Sam Outrell, the janitor, came out from behind the desk as he entered the lobby. "Those men was here, sir, about 2 hours ago, like you said they would be," he reported. "Said you sent 'em to measure for the windows for some new curtains. I let 'em in like you told me, and they went through all the rooms." "Thanks a lot, Sam," said the saint, and rode up in the lift with another piece of his mosaic settled neatly into place. He came into the living room like a ray of sunshine and spun his hat over Patricia's head into a corner. "Medical tea is on the air in about 10 minutes, he said, with a program of chamber music. Could anything be more appropriate?" Patricia looked up from her book. "I suppose you've heard about our curtain measurers?" "Yes, Sam Outrell told me." "Do I get my diploma in advanced prophetics?" "After the party I had this morning, I knew it wouldn't be long before someone wanted to know what had happened to Comrade Maguire. Did you get him to Weybridge in good condition? He didn't seem to like being locked in the trunk of the Daimler very much." The saint grinned, and sat down at the desk to dismantle his automatic. He opened a drawer and fished out brushes and rags and cleaning oil. "Well, I'm sure he preferred it to be nailed up in a coffin," he said carelessly, "and he's safe enough there with Otis on guard. They won't find him in the secret room, even if they do think of looking down there. Be a darling, start tuning in Radio Cavados, would you?" For a short while she was busy with the dials of the radiogram, and then she came back and watched him in silence while he went over his gun with the loving care of a man who knew how much might hang on the light touch of a trigger. "Something else has happened," she said at last, "and you're holding out on me." Simon squinted complacently up a barrel like burnished silver and snapped the sliding jacket back into place. There was a dynamic exuberance in his repose that no artist could have captured, an aura of resilient swiftness poised on a knife-edge of balance that sent queer little feathery ripples up her spine. "A lot more is going to happen," he said, "and then I'll tell you what a genius I am." She would have made some reply, but suddenly he fell into utter stillness with a quick lift of his hand. Out of the radio, which had been briefly silent, floated the opening bars of the Spring Song, and his watch told him that it was the start of the Medical Tea Company's contribution to the load that the 20th century ether has to bear. Shortly the music faded to form a background for a delicate Oxford accent, informing the world that this melody fairly portrayed the sensations of a sufferer from indigestion after drinking a nice big cup of medical tea. There followed an unusually nauseating dissertation on the manifold virtues of the product, and then a screeching slaughter of the Grand March from Tannhauser, played by the same string quartet. Patricia got up pallidly and poured herself out a drink. "I suppose we have to listen to this," she said. "Wait," said the saint. The rendition came to its awful end, and the voice of medical tea polluted the air once again. "Before we continue our melody program, we should like to read you a few extracts from our file of unsolicited letters from sufferers who have tried medical tea. Tonight we are choosing letters 1006, 1014, and 1027. The unsolicited letters were read with frightful enthusiasm, and the saint listened with such intentness that he was obviously paying no attention to the transparently bogus effusions. He sat with the gun turning gently in his hands, and a blindingly beatific smile creeping by hesitant degrees into the lines of his chiseled fighting mouth, so that the girl looked at him in uncomprehending wonderment. And there, ladies and gentlemen, you have the opinions of the writers, whose letters are numbered 1006, 1014, and 1027 in our files," said the voice of the announcer, speaking with tedious deliberation. "These good people cured themselves by drinking medical tea. Let me urge you to buy medical tea tonight. Buy medical tea. And now the string quartet will play Drink to Me Only." There were 2 more short numbers, and the broadcast was over. Simon switched off the radio as the next advertiser plunged into his act. "Well," said Patricia mutinously, "are you going to talk?" "You heard as much as I did." "I didn't hear anything worth listening to." "Nor did I. That's the whole point. There wasn't anything worth listening to. I was looking for an elaborate code message. An expert like me can smell a code message as far off as a venerable gorgonzola. There's always a certain clumsiness in the phrasing. This was so simple I nearly missed it." Patricia gazed into the depths of her glass. She said, "Those numbers." He nodded. "The 1,000 part is just coverage. 6, 14, and 27 are the operative words. They have to buy medical tea tonight. Nothing else in the program means a thing, but according to that paper I brought in, medical tea broadcasts every night of the week, and that means that any night the big shot wants to, he can send out a call for the men he wants to come and get their orders or anything else that's waiting for them. It's the last perfect touch of organization. There's no connecting link that any detective on Earth could trace between a broadcast and any particular person who listens to it. It means that even if one of his operatives should be under suspicion, the big shot can contact him without the shadow of a chance of transferring suspicion to himself. You could think of hundreds of ways of working a few numbers into an advertising spiel, and I'll bet they have a new one every time." She looked at him steadily. "But you still haven't told me what—" The telephone rang before he could answer. Simon picked it up. "Metropolitan Police Maternity Home," he said. "Teal speaking," said a familiar voice with an unnecessarily pugnacious rap in it. "I've got the information you asked for about that phone number. The subscriber is Beren Inescu, 16 North Ashley Street, Berkeley Square. Now, what was that information you were going to give me in return?" The saint unpuckered his lips from a long, inaudible whistle. "Okay, Claude," he said, and the words lilted. "I guess you've earned it. You can start right now. Rush one of your squads to Osbert's Drugstore, 909 Victoria Street, The place where you bought your medical tea. The 3 other guys will be there shopping for medical tea at any moment from now on. Can't give any description of them, but there's one sure way to pick them out. Have one of your men go up to everyone who comes out of the shop and say, "Are you 6, 14, or 27?" If the guy jumps halfway out of his skin, he's one of the birds you want. And see that you get his medical tea as well. Medical tea, sizzled the detective with such a searing savagery that the saint's ribs suddenly ached with awful intention. I wish... He stopped. Then he said, "Well, what's this about medical tea? You're trying to be funny." "Oh, I've never been so serious in my life, Claude. Get those 3 guys and get their packets of medical tea. You'll find something interesting in them." Teal's silence reeked of tormented indecision. "If I thought, but you never have, Claude. Don't spoil your record now. Just send that squad out and tell them to hustle. You'll stay by the telephone, and I ought to be able to call you within an hour to collect the big shot." "But you haven't told me," again Teal's voice wailed off abruptly. Something like a stifled groan squeezed into the gap. He spoke again in a fevered gabble. All right, I'll do it. Can't stop now to argue, but God help you." The connection clicked off even quicker than the sentence could finish. Simon fitted his automatic into the spring-clip holster under his coat and stood up with a slow smile of ineffable impishness creeping up to his eyes. Chapter 12. 16 North Ashley Street stood in the middle of one of those rows of crowded but discreetly opulent dwellings which provide the less squalid aspect of certain parts of Mayfair. Lights could be seen in some of the windows, indicating that someone was at home. The saint was not at all troubled about that. It was, in fact, a stroke of luck, which he had hoped for. He stepped up to the front door with an easy aplomb of an invited guest, arriving punctually for dinner, and put his finger on the bell. He looked as cool as if he had come straight off the ice, but under the rakish brim of his hat, the hell-for-leather mischief still rollicked in his eyes. One hand rested idly between the lapels of his coat, as if he were adjusting his tie. The door opened, exposing a large and overwhelming butler. The saint's glance weighed him with expert penetration. Butlers are traditionally large and overwhelming, but they are apt to run large in the wrong places. This butler was large in the right places. His shoulders looked as wide as a wardrobe, and his biceps stretched tight wrinkles into the sleeves of his well-cut coat. "Baron Enescu?" inquired the saint pleasantly. "The Baron is not." Simon smiled and pressed the muzzle of his gun a little more firmly into the stomach in front of him. The butler recoiled, and the saint stepped after him. He pushed the door shut with his heel. "Turn round." Tensely, the butler started to obey. He had not quite finished the movement when Simon lifted his gun and jerked it crisply down again. The barrel made a sharp smacking sound on the back of the butler's bullet head, and the result, from an onlooker's point of view, was quite comical. The butler's legs bowed outwards, and he rolled down onto his face with a kind of resigned reluctance, and lay motionless. For a second, the saint stood still, listening. But except for that single clear-cut smack, there had been no disturbance, and the house remained quiet and peaceful. Simon's eyes swept round the hall. In a corner close to the front door, there was a door which looked as if it belonged to a coat cupboard. It was a coat cupboard. The saint pocketed his gun for long enough to drag the butler across the marble floor and shove him in. He locked the door on him and took the key. He was a pretty accurate judge of the competitive toughness of gun barrels and skulls, and he was confident that the butler would not be constituting a vital factor in anybody's life for some time. He traveled past the other doors on the ground floor like a voyaging wraith, listening at each one of them, but he could hear no signs of life in any of the rooms beyond. From the head of the basement stairs, he heard an undisturbed clink of dishes and the mutter of voices, which reassured him that the rest of the staff were strictly minding their own business. In another moment, he was on his way up the main staircase. On the first wide landing, he knew he was near his destination. Under one door, there was a thin streak of light, and as he inched noiselessly up to it, he heard the faint, syncopated patter of a typewriter. Then the soft burr of a telephone interrupted it. A voice said, "Yes?" "Yes." There was a slight pause, then, "Vernon? Here's your copy for the special 9 o'clock broadcast. Take it down. Why suffer from indigestion when the relief is so cheap? 2 cups will make your pains vanish. Only 2. 4 cups will set you on the road to a complete cure, so why not take 4? But after 16 cups, you'll forget that indigestion ever existed. Think of that. 16 cups will make you feel 10 years younger. Wouldn't you like to feel 10 years younger in a few days? Buy medical tea tonight. Have you got that? Splendid. Good night. The receiver rattled back, and the latch of the door rattled as Simon Templar closed it behind him. The man at the desk spun round as if a snake had bitten him. "Good evening, Bedden," said the saint. He stood there, smiling, blithe and elegant and indescribably dangerous. The Bedden stared frozenly back at him. He was a tall, clean-shaven man with dark hair graying at the temples, and he wore impeccable evening clothes with the distinction of an ambassador. But he had spoken on the telephone in a voice that was quite strangely out of keeping with his appearance, and the saint's smile deepened with the joy of final certainty as he held his gun steadily aligned on the pole stood in the center of the Bedden's snowy shirt front. The first leap of fear crossed the Bedden's dark eyes, turned into a convincing blaze of anger. "What's the meaning of this?" "At a rough guess, I should say about 15 years. For you," answered the saint equably. "It'll be quite a change from your usual environment, I'm afraid. That is, if I can judge by the pictures I've seen of you in the society papers. Bedden Eskew driving off the first tee at St. Andrews. Bedden Eskew at the wheel of his yacht at Cowes. Bedden Eskew climbing into his new racing monoplane. I'm afraid you'll find the sporting facilities rather limited at Dartmoor, Bedden. Or would you rather I called you Henry?" The Bedden sat very still. "You know a great deal, Mr. Templar." "Just about all I need to know, I think. I know you've been running the most efficient espionage organization that poor Chief Inspector Teal has had to scratch his head over for a long time. I know that you had everything lined up so well that you might have got away with it for years, if it hadn't been for one of those acts of God that the insurance companies never want to underwrite. I told you I knew all about it this morning, but you wouldn't believe me. By the way, how's the jaw feel tonight?" The other watched him unwinkingly. "I'm afraid I did find it hard to believe you," he said evenly. "What else do you know?" "I know all about your phony broadcast, and if it's of any interest to you, there'll be a squad of large, flat-footed boogeymen waiting for numbers 6, 14, and 27 when they stop by for their medical tea. I also know that instead of getting ready to pay me the tax that I asked for, you tried to frame me for the murder of Nancock this afternoon, and I resent that, Henry." "I apologize," said the Bedden suavely. "You shall have your money tomorrow." The saint shook his head, and his eyes were glacially blue. "You had your chance, and you passed it up. I shall help myself to the money." He saw the other's eyes shift fractionally to the safe in the corner, and laughed softly. "Give me the keys, Henry." The Bedden hesitated a moment before he moved. Then he put his hand slowly into his trouser pocket and pulled out a bunch of keys on a platinum chain. He detached them and threw them onto the desk. "You have the advantage, Mr. Templar," he said smoothly. "I give you the keys because you could easily take them yourself if I refuse, but you're very foolish. There are only about £3,000 in the safe. Why not be sensible and wait till the morning? In the morning you'll be too busy trying to put up a defense at the police court to think about me," said the saint coldly. He moved towards the desk, but he did not pick up the keys at once. His eyes strayed to the sheet of paper and the typewriter, and yet they did it in such a way that the Bedden still knew that the first move he made would call shattering death to the trim, unwavering automatic. Simon read, "In conjunction with numbers 4, 10, and 16, you will proceed at once to Cheltenham and establish close watch on Sir Rowland Hale, who is on holiday there. Within 24 hours, you will send a report on the method by which urgent War Office messages—" Simon's eyes returned to the Bedden's face. "What more evidence do you think Chief Inspector Teal will need?" he said. "With a name like mine," came the scornful answer. "When I tell them that you held me at the point of a gun while you wrote that message on my typewriter, oh, I'm sure they'll be very polite," said the saint, "especially when they find that yours are the only fingerprints on the keys. If you made me write it under compulsion, and the orders in the packets of medical tea, which numbers 6, 14, and 27 are going to buy tonight, came from the same machine." The Bedden moistened his lips. "Let's talk this over," he said. The saint said, "You talk." He picked up the telephone and dialed 0. He said, "Yes, operator, I want to make a call to France. Radio Calvados." The Bedden swallowed. Wait a minute, he said desperately. Incidentally, said the Saint, there'll be a record that you had a call to Radio Calvados this evening, and probably on lots of other evenings as well. I'm sure we shall find that Henry Osbert moustache of yours somewhere in the house, not to mention the beard you wore when you were dealing with Red Maguire. I suppose you needed some thug outside the organization in case you wanted to deal drastically with any of the ordinary members, but you picked the wrong man in Red. He doesn't like hot curling irons. Inescu's fist clenched until the knuckles were bleached. His face had gone pale under its light tan. The Saint's call came through. "Mr. Vernon, please," he said. He took out a cigarette case, opened it, and lit a cigarette with the hand that held his gun, all in some astonishing manner that never allowed the muzzle to wander for an instant from its aim on the Bedouin's shirt stud. And then an unmistakable Oxford accent said, "Hello?" "Vernon," said the Saint. His voice was so exactly like the voice affected by Mr. Henry Osbert that its originator could scarcely believe his ears. "I've got to make a change in that copy I just gave you. Make it read like this. They say there's safety in numbers. In that case, you can't go wrong with medical T. There are many numbers in our files, but they all praise medical T. Every number has the same message. Why should you be left out? All of you, buy medical T tonight. Have you got it? Good. See that it goes on without fail." Simon pressed the spring bracket down with his thumb, still holding the receiver. The Bedouin's stare was wide and stupefied. "You're mad," he said hoarsely. "You're throwing away your fortune." Simon laughed at him, and lifted the receiver to his ear again. It dialed the number of Scotland Yard. "Give me Chief Inspector Teal," he said. "The Saint calling." There was some delay on the switchboard. The Saint looked at Bedouin and Eskew and said, "There's one thing you forget, Bedouin. I like money as much as anybody else, and I use more of it than most people, but that's a sideline. I also deliver justice. When you get to Dartmoor, you'll meet some of the men I've sent there. Ask them about it, and then you in your turn will be able to tell the same story." The voice of Chief Inspector Teal blared short-windedly in his ear. "Yes? Oh, Claude, how's the old tum-tum getting? All right, if it's a sore subject, but I wondered. Yes, of course I have. Just a minute. Did you get 6, 14, and 27? Simon listened, and the contentment ripened on his face. "Well, didn't I tell you? And now you can have some more for the bag. At any time after 9 o'clock, there's going to be a perfect stampede of blokes asking for medical tea, so you can send your squad back for more. They'd better take over the shop and grab everyone who tries to buy medical tea, and while they're doing that, I've got the big shot waiting for you. Come and get him. The address is, excuse me." The Saint had the telephone in one hand and a gun in the other, and it seemed impossible for him to have done it, but a narrow-bladed, ivory-hilted knife stuck quivering in the desk half an inch from the Bedouin's fingers as they slid toward a concealed bell, and the Saint went on talking as if nothing had happened. 16 North Ashley Street, Berkeley Square. The name is Inescu. Yes, isn't that a coincidence? But there's all the evidence you'll need to make you happy, so I don't see why you should complain. Come along over and I'll show you." "I'll send someone over," Teal said stiffly, "and thanks very much." Simon frowned a little. "Why send someone?" he objected. "I thought because I'm busy," came a tortured howl that nearly shattered the receiver. "I can't leave the office just now. I have to send someone." The Saint's eyebrows slowly lifted. "But why?" he persisted. Eventually, Mr. Teal told him. Chapter 13. Simon Templar sat on the desk in Chief Inspector Teal's office a fortnight later. The police court proceedings had just been concluded after a remand, and Bedouin and Eskew, alias Henry Osbert, had been committed for trial in company with some 36 smaller cogs in his machine. The report was in the evening paper which Simon had bought, and he pointed it out to Teal accusingly. "At least you could have rung me up and thanked me again for making you look like a great detective," he said. Mr. Teal strip-teased a slice of chewing gum and fed it into his mouth. "I'm sorry," he said. "I meant to do it, but there was a lot of clearing up work to do on the case. Anyway, it's out of my hands now. The public prosecutor's pretty satisfied. It's a pity there wasn't enough direct evidence to charge Inescu with the murder of Nancock, but I haven't done badly." "You're looking pretty cheerful," said the Saint. This was true. Mr. Teal's rosy face had a fresh pink glow, and his cherubic blue eyes were clear and bright under his sleepily drooping lids. "I'm feeling better," he said. "You know, that's the thing that really beats me about this case. Inescu could have made a fortune out of medical tea without ever going in for espionage." The Saint's mouth fell open. You don't mean to say, he ejaculated and couldn't go on. He said, but I thought you were ready to chew the blood out of anyone who had anything to do with medical tea if you could only have gotten away from... Well, I know it was rather drastic, Teal said sheepishly, but it did the trick. You know, I haven't had a single attack of indigestion since I took that packet. I even had a roast pork for dinner last night. Simon Templar drew a long, deep breath and closed his eyes. There were times when even he felt he was standing on holy ground. The end. Well, that was a rather good one. And actually, the Medical Tea Party was an episode of The Saint. I have to look this up real quick. Yes. It's the third season of The Saint in episode 1. And it was called The Medical Tea Party. And it's actually available for streaming in some spots. Depends on where in the world you're watching. But, yeah. No, this was one that they actually turned into an episode of the Saint television show. I seem to remember it was rather good. Right, we'll get started on another one called The Invisible Millionaire. Give me just a moment, chat. I want to troubleshoot something with the tracking on my brand new model here. So give me just a moment. That was actually quite the nice... Well, thank you, Malachi. Thank you. Thank you so much. All right, I think I've got it working again. Maybe. I may just have to adjust the camera angle here. Hang on. Let's try that. I think that's better. Maybe. I don't know. I may also have to get in a little bit closer to the camera. Oh, I'll figure it out. Let's see. Oh, would you look at that? Looks like the chat has completely disappeared. Chat, I'm not able to go back and look at the VOD just yet, but has any of the... Oh, there it goes. Okay. Alright, good. I was concerned that I've been going an entire stream without the chat showing up. Alright. I think it just reload. Yeah, you're probably right. I don't know. Stream Elements has been having, or Streamlabs rather, has been having some issues as of late. Where, no, it was definitely there. Okay, good. Yeah. I'd noticed Sunday afternoon and early in the week, there had been some difficulties with getting chat to display on Twitch streams. And a friend of mine who is set to debut for their Twitch stream as a VTuber was having some difficulty getting it to show up as well. And it doesn't look like the calibrations have taken with this. Just a moment, chat. I need to look at something here. Let's try calibrating this. Now, maybe that will do the trick. Yeah, that looks better now. Maybe. Just had to recalibrate the facial tracking, everyone. Sorry about that. Yes, his lordship just did a face reveal. Oh dear. Sorry, bro, didn't see. That's all right. That's all right. Reverse. Right, let's continue on with our reading, shall we? Let's see. Gosh, wrapping that one, that only took us an hour. Well, let's go ahead and have another one. This one's called The Invisible Millionaire. And we'll start with chapter 1. I'm listening while they're building Minecraft, so I wasn't even here to see it. That's all right. It was just showing the grid outline there in VTube Studio of my face getting caught by the tracking. Did not show my actual face, just to be perfectly clear. But yeah, it, just had to do a quick recalibration. I think that did it. Of course, it might have been just I don't know. I'm probably gonna have to keep doing a bit of jiggery pokery on it. Anyway, chapter 1 of The Invisible Millionaire. The girl's eyes caught Simon Templar as he entered the room, ducking his head instinctively to pass under the low lintel of the door, and they followed him steadily across to the bar. They were blue eyes with long lashes, and the face to which they belonged was pretty without any distinctive feature, crowned with curly yellow hair. And besides anything else, the eyes held an indefinable hint of strain. Simon knew all this without looking directly at her, but he had singled her out at once from the double handful of riverside weekenders who crowded the small barroom as the most probable writer of the letter which he still carried in his pocket. The letter which had brought him out to the Bell that Sunday evening on what anyone with a less incorrigibly optimistic flair for adventure would have branded from the start as a fool's errand. She was the only girl in the place who seemed to be unattached. There was no positive reason why the writer of that letter should have been unattached, but it seemed likely that she would be. Also, she was the best looker in a by no means repulsive crowd, and that was simply no clue at all except Simon Templar's own unshakable faith in his guardian angel, who had never known any other kind of damsel in distress, who had never thrown any other kind of damsel in distress into his buccaneering path. But she was still looking at him, and even though he couldn't help knowing that women often looked at him with more than ordinary interest, it was not usually done quite so fixedly. His hopes rose a notch, tentatively. It was her turn to make the next move. He had done all that had been asked of him when he walked in there punctually on the stroke of 8. He leaned on the counter, with his wide shoulders seeming to take up half the length of the bar, and ordered a pint of beer for himself and a bottle of VAT 69 for Hoppy Unyats, who trailed up thirstily at his heels. With the tankard in his hands, he waited for one of those inevitable moments when all the customers had paused for breath at the same time. "Anyone leave a message for me?" he asked. His voice was quiet and casual, but just clear enough for everyone in the room to hear. Whoever had sent for him, unless it was merely some pointless practical joker, should need no more confirmation than that. He hoped it would be the girl with the blue troubled eyes. He had a weakness for girls with eyes of that shade, the same color as his own. The barman shook his head. "No, sir. Haven't had any messages." Simon went on gazing at him reflectively, and the barman misinterpreted his expression. His mouth broadened and said, "That's all right, sir. I'd know if there was anything for you." Simon's fine brows lifted a little puzzledly. "I haven't seen you before," he said. "I've seen your picture often enough, sir. I suppose you could call me one of your fans. You're the saint, aren't you?" The saint smiled slowly. "You don't look frightened. Never had the chance to be a rich racketeer like the people you're always getting after. Gosh, though, I've had a kick out of some of the things you've done to him. And the way you're always putting it over on the police, I'll bet they'd give anything for an excuse to lock you up. Simon was aware that the general buzz of conversation, after starting to pick up again, had died a second time and was staying dead. His spine itched with the feel of stairs fastening on his back. At the same time, the barman became feverishly conscious of the audience which had been captured by his runaway enthusiasm. He began to stammer, turned red, and plunged confusedly away to obliterate himself in some unnecessary fussing over the shelves of bottles behind him. The saint grinned with his eyes only, and turned tranquilly round to lean his back against the bar and face the room. The collected stares hastily unpinned themselves, and the voices got going again. But Simon was as oblivious of those events as he would have been if the rubbernecking had continued. At that moment his mind was capable of absorbing only one fearful and calamitous realization. He had turned to see whether the girl with the fair curly hair and the blue eyes had also been listening, and whether she needed any more encouragement to announce herself. And the girl was gone. She must have got up and gone out, even in the short time that the barman had been talking. The saint's glance swept on to identify the other faces in the room, faces that he had noted and automatically catalogued as he came in. They were all the same, but her face was not one of them. There was an empty glass beside her chair, and the chair itself was already being taken by a dark, slender girl who had just entered. Interest lighted the saint's eyes again as he saw her, awakened instantly as he appreciated the subtle perfection of the sculpted cascade of her brown hair, crystallized as he approved the contours of her slim yet mature figure, revealed by a simple flowered cotton dress. Then he saw her face for the first time, and held his tankard a shade tighter. Here indeed was something to call beautiful, something on which the word could be used without hesitation, even under his most dispassionate scrutiny. She was like peaches in autumn, he said to himself, seeing the fresh bloom of her cheeks against the russet shades of her hair. She raised her head with a smile, and his blood sang carillons. Perhaps after all. And then he saw that she was smiling and speaking to an ordinarily good-looking young man in a striped blazer who stood possessively over her, and inward laughter overtook him before he could feel the sourness of disappointment. He loosened one elbow from the bar to run a hand through his dark hair, and his eyes twinkled at Hoppy. "Oh, well, Hoppy," he said, "looks as if we can still be taken for a ride even at our age." Mr. Unyats blinked at him. Even in isolation, the face that nature had planted on top of Mr. Unyats' bull neck could never have been mistaken for that of a matinee idol with an inclination toward intellectual pursuits and the cultivation of the soul. But when viewed in exaggerated contrast with the tanned, piratical chiseling of the saint's features, it had a grotesqueness that was sometimes completely shattering to those who beheld it for the first time. To compare it with the face of a gorilla which had been in violent contact with a variety of blunt instruments during its formative years would be risking the justifiable resentment of any gorilla which had been in violent contact with a variety of blunt instruments during its formative years. The best that can be said of it is that it contained, in mauled and primitive form, all of the usual organs of sight, smell, hearing, and ingestion, and prayerfully let it go at that. And yet it must also be said that Simon Templar had come to regard it with a fondness which even its mother could scarcely have shared. He watched it with good-humored patience, waiting for it to answer. "I don't know, boss," said Mr. Unyats. He had not thought over the point very deeply. Simon knew this because when Mr. Unyats was thinking, his face screwed itself into even more frightful contortions than was stamped on it in repose. Thinking of any kind was an activity which caused Mr. Unyats excruciating pain. On this occasion, he had clearly escaped much suffering, because his mind, if such a word can be used without blasphemy, in connection with any of Mr. Unyats' cerebral processes, had been elsewhere. "Something's bothering you, Hoppy," said the saint. "Don't keep it to yourself, or your head will start aching." "Boss," said Mr. Unyats gratefully, Do I have to drink this with the paper on? He held out the parcel he was nursing. Simon looked at him blankly for a moment, then felt weak in the middle. Of course not, he said. They only wrapped it up because they thought that we were going to take it home. They haven't got to know you yet, that's all. An expression of sublime relief spread over Mr. Uniatz's homely countenance as he poured off the wrapping paper from the bottle of VAT 69. He pulled out the cork, placed the neck of the bottle in his mouth, and tilted his head back. The soothing fluid flowed in a cooling stream down his asbestos gullet. All of his anxieties were at rest. For the saint, consolation was not quite so easy. He finished his tankard and pushed it across the bar for a refill. While he was waiting for it to come back, he pulled out of his pocket and read over again the note that had brought him there. It was on a plain sheet of good notepaper with no address. Dear Saint, I'm not going to write a long letter because if you aren't going to believe me, it won't make any difference how many pages I write. I'm only writing to you at all because I'm utterly desperate. How can I put it in the boldest possible way? I'm being forced into making myself an accomplice in one of the most gigantic frauds that can ever have been attempted, and I can't go to the police for the same reason that I'm being forced to help. There you are. No use writing any more. If you can be at the Bell at Hurley at 8 o'clock on Sunday evening, I'll see you and tell you everything. If I can only talk to you for half an hour, I know I can make you believe me. Please, for God's sake, at least let me talk to you. My name is Nora Prescott. Nothing had to encourage too many hopes in the imagination of anyone whose mail was as regularly cluttered with crank letters as the saint's, and yet the handwriting looked neat and sensible, and the brief, blunt phrasing had somehow carried more conviction than a ream of prostrations. All the rest had been hunch, that supernatural affinity for the dark trails of ungodliness that which had pitchforked him into the middle of more brews of mischief than any 4 other freebooters of his day. And for once, the hunch had been wrong. Only it hadn't been for that humdrumly handsome excrescence in the striped blazer. Simon looked up again for another tantalizing eyeful of the dark, slender girl. It was just in time to get a parting glimpse of her back as she made her way to the door, with the striped blazer hovering over her like a motherly hen. Then she was gone, and everyone else in the bar suddenly looked nondescript and obnoxious. The saint sighed. He took a deep draught of his beer and turned back to Hoppy Uniatz. The neck of the bottle was still firmly clamped in Hoppy's mouth, and there was no evidence to show it had ever been detached therefrom since it was first inserted. His Adam's apple throbbed up and down with the regularity of a slow pulse. The angle of the bottle indicated that at least a pint of its contents had already reached his interior. Simon gazed at him in reverence. "You know, Hoppy," he remarked, "when you die, we shan't even have to embalm you. We'll just put you straight into a glass case, and you'll keep for years." The other customers had finally returned to their own business, except for a few who were innocently watching for Mr. Uniatz to stiffen and fall backwards, and the talkative young barman edged up again with a show of wiping off the bar. "Nothing much here to interest you tonight, sir, is there?" he began chattily. "There was," said the saint ruefully, "but she went home." "You mean the dark young lady, sir?" "Who else?" The man nodded knowingly. "You ought to come here more often, sir. Seen her in here alone. Miss Rosemary Chase, that is. Her father's Mr. Marvin Chase, the millionaire. He just took the new manor for the season. Had a nasty motor accident only a week ago." The saint let him go on talking without paying much attention. The dark girl's name wasn't Nora Prescott anyhow. That seemed to be the only important item of information, and with it went the last of his hopes. The clock over the bar crept on to 20 minutes past 8. If the girl who had written to him had been as desperate as she said, she wouldn't come as late as that. She'd have been waiting there when he arrived. The girl with the strained blue eyes had probably been suffering from nothing worse than biliousness and thwarted love. Rosemary Chase had happened merely by accident. The real writer of the letter was almost certainly some fat, frowsy female among those he had passed over without a second thought, who was doubtless still gloating over him from some obscure corner, gorging herself with the spectacle of her inhibition's hero in the flesh. A hand grasped at his elbow, turning him round, and a lightly accented voice said, "Why, Mr. Templar, what are you looking so sad about?" The saint's smile kindled as he turned. "Julio," he said, If I could be sure that keeping a pub would make anyone as cheerful as you, I'd go right out and buy a pub. Giulio Trapani beamed at him teasingly. Why should you need anything to make you cheerful? You're young, strong, handsome, rich, and famous. Or perhaps you're only waiting for a new romance. Giulio, said the saint, that's a very sore point at the moment. Ah, perhaps you're waiting for a love letter which has not arrived. The saint straightened up with a jerk. All at once he laughed. Half incredulous sunshine smashed through his despondency, lighted up his face. He extended his palm. You old son of a gun, give. The landlord brought his left hand from behind his back, holding an envelope. Simon grabbed it and ripped it open. He recognized the handwriting at a glance. The note was on a sheet of hotel paper. Thank God you came. But I daren't be seen speaking to you after the barman recognized you. Go down to the lock and walk up the towpath. Not very far along on the left, there's a boathouse with green doors. I'll wait for you there. Hurry. The saint raised his eyes and sapphires danced in them. Who gave you this, Giulio? Nobody. It was lying on the floor outside when I came through. You saw the envelope. Deliver it once to Mr. Templar in the bar. So that's what I do. Is that what you were waiting for? Simon stuffed the note into his pocket and nodded. It drained his tankard. This is the romance you were talking about. Maybe, he said. I'll tell you about it later. Save some dinner for me. I'll be back. He clapped Trapani on the shoulder and swung round, newly awakened, joyously alive again. Perhaps in spite of everything, there was still adventure to come. Let's go, Hoppy. He took hold of Mr. Uniatz's bottle and pulled it down. Hoppy came upright after it with a plaintive gasp. Cheese, boss. Have you no soul? Demanded the saint sternly, as he herded him out the door. We've a date with the damsel in distress. The moon will be mirrored in her beautiful eyes, and she'll pant out a story while we fan the gnats away from her snowy brow. Sinister eggs are being hatched behind the scenes. There'll be villains and mayhem and perhaps even moider. He went on talking lyrical nonsense as he sat a brisk pace down the lane towards the river. But when they reached the towpath, even he had dried up. Mr. Uniatz was an unresponsive audience, and Simon found that some of the things he was saying in jest were oddly close to the truth that he believed. After all, such fantastic things had happened to him before. He didn't fully understand the change in himself as he turned off along the riverbank out beside the dark, shimmering sleekness of the water. The ingrained flippancy was still with him. He could feel it like a translucent film over his mind. But underneath it, he was all open and expectant, a receptive void in which anything might take shape. And something was beginning to take shape there, something still so nebulous and formless that it eluded any conscious survey, and yet something as inescapably real as a promise of thunder in the air. It was as if the hunch that had brought him out to the bell in the first place had leapt up from a whisper to a great shout, and yet everything was silent. Far away to his sensitive ears, there was the ghostly hum of cars on the Maidenhead Road. Close by, the sibilant lap of the river, the lisp of leaves, the stertorous breathing and elephantine footfalls of Mr. Uniatz. But those things were only phases of the stillness that was everywhere. Everything in the world was quiet, even his own nerves, and they were almost too quiet. And ahead of him, presently, loomed the shape of a building like a boathouse. His pencil flashlight stabbed out for a second and caught the front of it. It had green doors. Quietly, he said, Nora. There was no answer, no hint of movement anywhere. And he didn't know why, but in the same quiet way his right hand slid up to his shoulder rig and loosened the automatic in the spring clip under his arm. He covered the last 2 yards in absolute silence, put his hand to the handle of the door, and drew it back quickly as his fingers slid on a sticky dampness. It was queer, he thought even then, even as his left hand angled the flashlight down, that it should have happened just like that, when everything in him was tuned and waiting for it, without knowing what it was waiting for. Blood on the door. Chapter 2. Simon stood for a moment, and his nerves seemed to grow even calmer and colder, under an edge of sharp bitterness. Then he grasped the door handle again, turned it, and went in. The inside of the building was pitch dark. His torch needled the blackness with a thin jet of light that splashed dim reflections from the glossy varnish on a couple of punts and an electric canoe. Somehow, he was quite sure what he would find, so sure that the certainty chilled off any rise of emotion. He knew what it must be. The only question was, who? Perhaps even that was not such a question. He was never quite sure about that. A hunch that had almost missed its mark had become stark reality with suddenness that disjointed the normal coordinates of time and space. It was as if instead of discovering things, he was trying to remember things he had known before and had forgotten. But he saw her at last, almost tucked under the shadow of the electric canoe, lying on her side, as if she were asleep. He stepped over and bent his light steadily on her face, and knew then that he had been right. It was the girl with the troubled blue eyes. Her eyes were open now, only they were not troubled any more. The saint stood and looked down at her. He had been almost sure when he saw the curly yellow hair. But she had been wearing a white blouse when he saw her last, and now there was a splotchy crimson pattern on the front of it. The pattern glistened as he looked at it. Beside him there was a noise like an asthmatic foghorn loosening up for a burst of song. "Boss," began Mr. Unietz. "Shut up." Saint's voice was hardly more than a whisper, but it cut like a razor blade. It cut Hoppy's introduction cleanly off from whatever he had been going to say, and at the same moment as he spoke, Simon switched off his torch. So that it was as if the same tenuous whisper had sliced off even the ray of light, leaving nothing around them but blackness and silence. Motionless in the dark, the saint quested for any betraying breath of sound. To his tautened eardrums, sensitive as a wild animal's, the hushed murmurs of the night outside were still an audible background against which the slightest stealthy movement, even at a considerable distance, would have stood out like a bugle call. But he heard nothing then, though he waited for several seconds in uncanny stillness. He switched on the torch again. "Okay, Hoppy," he said. "Sorry to interrupt you, but that blood was so fresh I wondered if someone mightn't still be around." "Boss," said Mr. Unietz aggrievedly, "I was doing fine when you stopped me." "Never mind," said the saint consolingly. "You can go ahead now. Take a deep breath and start again." He was still partly listening for something else, wondering if even then the murderer might still be within range. "Ain't no use now," said Mr. Unietz dolefully. "You're going to get temperamental on me?" Simon demanded sufferingly, because if so, Mr. Unietz shook his head. "It ain't that, boss. You gotta start with a full bottle." Simon focused him through a kind of fog, in an obscure and apparently irrelevant sort of way. He became aware that Hoppy was still clinging to the bottle of VAT 69, with which he had been irrigating his tonsils at the bell, and that he was holding it up against the beam of the flashlight as though brooding over the level of liquid left in it. The saint clutched at the buttresses of his mind. "What in the name of Adam's grandfather," he said, "are you talking about?" "Well, boss, this is an idea I get out of a book. The guy walks in a saloon, buys a bottle of scotch, he pulls the cork, and he drinks the whole bottle straight down without stopping. So I was trying the same thing back in the pub. I was doing fine when you stopped me. Look it, I ain't left more than 2 or 3 swallows. But ain't no use going on now," explained Mr. Unietz, working back to the core of his grievance. "You gotta start with a full bottle." Nothing but years of training and self-discipline gave Simon Temple the strength to recover his sanity. "Next time, you better take the bottle away somewhere and lock yourself up with it," he said, with terrific moderation. "Just for the moment, since we haven't got another bottle, is there any danger of your noticing that someone has been murdered around here?" "Yeah," Mr. Unietz said brightly. "Duren." Having contributed his share of illumination, he relapsed into benevolent silence. This, his expectant self-effacement, appeared to suggest was not his affair. It appeared to be something which required thinking about, and thinking was a job for which the saint possessed an obviously supernatural aptitude, which Mr. Unietz had come to lean upon with a childlike faith that was very much akin to worship. The saint was thinking. He was thinking with a level and passionless detachment that surprised even himself. The girl was dead. He had seen plenty of men killed before, sometimes horribly, but only one other woman. Yet that must not make any difference. Nora Prescott had never meant anything to him. He would never even have recognized her voice. Other women of whom he knew just as little would dine everywhere in one way or another. Every time he breathed, and he could think about it without the slightest feeling, Nora Prescott was just another name in the world's long roll of undistinguished dead. But she was someone who had asked him for help, who had perhaps died because of what she had wanted to tell him. She hadn't been just another twittering fluffhead going into hysterics over a mouse. She really had known something. Something that was dangerous enough for someone else to commit murder, rather than have it revealed. One of the most gigantic frauds that can ever have been attempted. The only phrase out of her letter which gave any information at all came into his head again. Not as a merely provocative combination of words, but with some of the clean-cut clarity of a sober statement of fact. And yet the more he considered it, the closer it came to clarifying precisely nothing. And he was still half listening for a noise that it seemed as if he ought to have heard. The expectation was a subtle nagging at the back of his mind, the fidget for attention of a thought that still hadn't found conscious shape. His torch panned once more around the interior of the building. It was a plain wooden structure, hardly more than 3 walls and a pair of double doors which formed the fourth, just comfortably roomy for the 3 boats which it contained. There was a small window on each side, so neglected as to be almost opaque. Overhead, his light went straight up to the bare rafters, which supported a shingle roof. There was no place in it for anybody to hide except under one of the boats, and his light probed along the floor and eliminated that possibility. The knife lay on the floor near the girl's knees, an ordinary cheap kitchen knife, but pointed and sharp enough for what it had to do. There was a smear of blood on the handle. Some of it must have gone on the killer's hand, or more probably on his glove, and in that way been left on the doorknob. From the stains and rents on the front of the girl's dress, the murderer must have struck 2 or 3 times. But if he was strong, he could have held her throat while he did it, and there need have been no noise. Efficient enough, the saint summed it up aloud, for a rush job. He was thinking it must have been a rush job, because he couldn't have known she was going to meet me here until after she'd written that note at the bell. Probably she didn't even know it herself until then. Did he see the note? Doesn't seem possible. He could have followed her. Then he must have had the knife on him already. Not an ordinary sort of knife to carry about with you. Then he must have known he was going to use it before he started out. Unless it was here in the boathouse and he just grabbed it up. No reason why a knife like that should be lying about in a place like this. A bit too convenient. Well, so he knew she'd got in touch with me, and he'd made up his mind to kill her. Then why not kill her before she even got to the bell? She might have talked to me then. He couldn't have stopped her. Could he? Was he betting that she wouldn't risk talking to me in public? It could have been. Good psychology, but the hell of a nerve to bet on it. Did he find out she'd written to me? Then I'd probably still have the letter. If I found her murdered, he'd expect me to go to the police with it. Dangerous. And he knew I'd find her. Then why? The saint felt something like an inward explosion as he realized what his thoughts were leading to. He knew then why half of his brain had never ceased to listen, searching for what intuition had scented faster than reason. Goose pimples crawled up his spine onto the back of his neck. And at that same moment he heard the sound. It was nothing that any other man might have heard at all, only the gritting of a few tiny specks of gravel between the stealthy shoe sole and the board stage outside. But it was what every nerve in his body had unwittingly been keyed for ever since he had seen the dead girl at his feet. It was what he inevitably had to hear after everything else had happened. It spun him round like a jerk of the string wound round a top. He was in the act of turning when the gun spoke. Its bark was curt and flat and left an impression of having been curiously thin, though his ears rang with it afterwards. The bullet zipped past his ear like a hungry mosquito, and from the hard, fierce note that it hummed, he knew that if he had not been starting to turn at the very instant when it was fired, it would have struck him squarely in the head. Pieces of shattered glass rattled on the floor. Light smashed into his eyes as he whirled at the door, and a clear, clipped voice snapped to him, "Drop that gun. Haven't got a chance." The light beat on him with blinding intensity from the lens of a pocket searchlight that completely swallowed up the slim ray of his own torch. He knew he hadn't a chance. He could have thrown bullets by guesswork, but to the man behind the glare, he was a target on which patterns could be punched out. Slowly, his fingers opened off the big Luger, and it plunked on the boards at his feet. His hand swept across and bent down the barrel of the automatic, which Mr. Uniatz had whipped out like lightning when the first shot crashed between them. "You too, Hoppy," he said resignedly. "Well, that Scotch will run away if they make a hole in you now." "Back away," came the next order. Simon obeyed. The voice said, "Go on, Rosemary. Pick up the guns. I'll keep them covered." A girl came forward into the light. It was the dark, slender girl whose quiet loveliness had unsteadied Simon's breath at the bell. Chapter 3. She bent over and collected the two guns by the butts, holding them aimed at Simon and Hoppy, not timidly, but with a certain stiffness which told the saint's expert eyes that the feel of them was unfamiliar. She moved backwards and disappeared again behind the light. "Do you mind if I smoke?" asked the saint ceremoniously. "I don't care." Clipped voice, he realized now, could only have belonged to the young man in the striped blazer. "But don't try to start anything, or I'll let you have it. Go on back in there." The saint did not move at once. He took out his cigarette case first, opened it, and selected a cigarette. The case came from his breast pocket, but he put it back in the pocket at his hip, slowly and deliberately, and holding it lightly so that his hand was never completely out of sight, and a nervous man would have no cause to be alarmed at the movement. He had another gun in that pocket, a light, beautifully balanced Walther, but for the time being he left it there, sliding the cigarette case in behind it and bringing his hand back empty to get out his lighter. "I'm afraid we weren't expecting to be held up in a place like this," he remarked apologetically. "So we left the family jewels at home. If you'd only let us know. Don't be funny. If you don't want to be turned over to the police, you better let me know what you're doing here." The saint's brows shifted a fraction of an inch. "I don't see what difference it makes to you, brother," he said slowly, "but if you're really interested, we're just taking a stroll in the moonlight to work up an appetite for dinner. We happened to see the door of this place open, so that's why you both had to pull out guns when you heard us." "My dear bloke," Simon argued reasonably, "what do you expect anyone to do when you creep up behind them and start sending bullets whistling around their heads?" There was a moment's silence. The girl gasped. The man spluttered, "Good God, you've got a nerve. After you blazed away at us like that, well, you might have killed one of us." The saint's eyes strained uselessly to pierce beyond the light. There was an odd hollow feeling inside him, making his frown unnaturally rigid. Something was going wrong. Something was going as immortally cockeyed as it was possible to go. It was taking him a perceptible space of time to grope for a bearing in the reeling void. Somewhere, the scenario had gone paralyzingly off the rails, as if a Wagnerian soprano had bounced into the hotcha dance routine in the middle of Tristan and Isolde. "Look," he said, "let's be quite clear about this. Is your story going to be that you thought I took a shot at you?" "I don't have to think," retorted the other. "I heard the bullet whiz past my head. Go on, get back in that boathouse." Simon dawdled back. His brain felt as if it was steaming. The voice behind the light, now that he was analyzing its undertones, had a tense unsophistication that didn't belong in the script at all, and the answers it gave were all wrong. Simon had it all figured out one ghostly instant before it began to happen. The murderer hadn't just killed Nora Prescott and faded away. Of course, he had killed her and waited outside, knowing that Simon Templar must find her in a few minutes, knowing that that would be his best chance to kill the saint as well and silence whatever the saint knew already and recover the letter. That much was so obvious that he must have been asleep not to have seen it from the moment when his eyes fell on the dead girl. Well, he had seen it now, and yet it wasn't clicking. The dialogue was all there, and yet every syllable was striking a false note. And he was back inside the boathouse as far as he could go, with the square bow of a punt against his calves and Hoppy beside him. The man's voice said, "Turn a light on, Rosemary." The girl came round and found a switch. Light broke out from the naked bulb, hung by a length of flex from one of the rafters. And the young man in the striped blazer flicked off his torch. "Now," he started to say, "Well, Jim!" The girl didn't quite scream, but her voice tightened and rose within a semitone of it. She backed against the wall, one hand to her mouth, with her face white and her eyes dilated with horror. The man began to turn towards her, and then followed her wide and frozen stare. The muzzle of the gun he was holding swung slack from its aim on the saint's chest as it did so. It was an error that in some situations would have cost him his life, but Simon let him live. The saint's head was whirling with too many questions just then to have any interest in the opportunity. He was looking at the gun which the girl was still holding, and recognizing it as the property of Mr. Unyats. "It's Nora," she gasped. "She's—" He saw her gather herself with an effort, force herself to go forward and kneel beside the body. Then he stopped watching her. His eyes went to the gun that was still wavering in the young man's hand. "Jim," said the girl brokenly, "she's dead." The man took a half-step toward the saint. "You swine," he grunted. "You killed her." "Go on," said the saint gently, "and then I took a pot at you. So you fired back in self-defense, and that just happened to kill us. It'll make a swell story, even if it isn't a very new one, and you'll find yourself quite a hero. But why all the play acting for our benefit? We know the gag." There was complete blankness behind the anger in the other's eyes, and all at once the saint's somersaulting cosmos stabilized itself with a jolt, upside down but solid. He was looking at the gun which was pointing at his chest and realizing it was his own Luger. And the girl had got Hoppy's gun, and there was no other artillery in sight. The arithmetic of it smacked him between the eyes and made him dizzy. Of course there was an excuse for him in the shape of the first shot, and the bullet had gone snarling past his ear, but even with all that, for him, out of all people in the world, at his time of life— "Run up to the house and call the police, Rosemary," said the striped blazer in a brittle bark. "Wait a minute," said the saint. His brain was not fogged any longer. It was turning over as swiftly and smoothly as a hair-balanced flywheel, registering every item with the mechanical infallibility of an adding machine. His nerves were tingling. His glance whipped from side to side. He was standing again approximately where he had been when the shot cracked out, but facing the opposite way. On his right quarter was the window that had been broken, with the shards of glass scattered on the floor below it. He ought to have understood everything when he heard him hit the floor. Turning the other way, he saw that the line from the window to himself continued on through the open door. He took a long drag on his cigarette. "Kind of spoils the scene," he said quietly, "but I'm afraid we've both been making the same mistake. You thought I fired at you. I don't have— All right, you don't have to think. You heard the bullet whiz past your head. You said that before. You're certain I shot at you. Okay. Well, I was just as certain you shot at me. But I know I was wrong. You never had a gun until you got mine. It was that shot that let you bluff me. I'd heard the bullet go past my head, so that it never even occurred to me that you were bluffing. But we were both wrong. The shot came through that window. It just missed me. Went on out through the door and just missed you. And somebody else fired it." The other's face was stupid with stubborn incredulity. "Who fired it?" "The murderer." "That means you," retorted the young man flatly. "Hell, I don't want to listen to you. You see if you can make the police believe you. Go on and call them, Rosemary. I can take care of these two." The girl hesitated. "But Jim—" "Don't worry about me, darling. I'll be all right. If either of these two washouts tries to get funny, I'll give him plenty to think about." The saint's eyes were narrowing. "You lace-panty bladder of hot air," he said in a cold, even voice that seared like vitriol. "It isn't your fault if God didn't give you a brain, but he did give you eyes. Why don't you use them? I say the shot was fired from outside, and you can see for yourself where the broken window pane fell. Look at it. It's all on the floor in here. If you can tell me how I could shoot you in the doorway and break a window behind me and make the broken glass fall inwards, I'll pay for your next Marcel wave. Look at it, you nitwit." The young man looked. He had been working closer to the saint, with his free fist clenched and his face flushed with wrath. since the saint's first sizzling insult smoked under his skin, but he looked. Somehow he had to do that. He was less than 5 feet away when his eyes shifted, and it was then that Simon jumped him. The saint's lean body seemed to lengthen and swoop across the intervening space. His left hand grabbed the Luger, bent the wrist behind it agonizingly inwards, while the heel of his open right hand settled under the other's chin. The gun came free, and the saint's right arm straightened jarringly and sent the young man staggering back. Simon reversed the automatic with a deft flip and held it on him. Even while he was making a spring, out of the corner of his eye he had seen Hoppy Oneynuts flash away from him with an electrifying acceleration that would have stunned anyone who had misguidedly judged Mr. Oneynuts on the speed of his intellectual reactions. Now he glanced briefly aside and saw that Hoppy was holding his gun again and keeping the girl pinioned with one arm. "Okay, Hoppy," he said. "Keep your Betsy and let her go. She's going to call the police for us." Hoppy released her, but the girl did not move. She stood against the wall, rubbing slim wrists that had been bruised by Mr. Oneynuts' untempered energy, looking from Simon to the striped blazer with scared, desperate eyes. "Go ahead," said the saint impatiently. "I won't damage little Jimmy unless he makes trouble. If this was one of my murdering evenings, you don't think I'd bump him and let you get away, do you? Go on and fetch your policeman, and we'll see whether the boyfriend can make them believe his story." I've lost track of who has the gun at this point. It looks like the saint and Hoppy got their guns back. Chapter 4. They had to wait for some time. After a minute, Simon turned the prisoner over to Hoppy and put his Luger away under his coat. He reached for his cigarette case again and thoughtfully helped himself to a smoke. With the cigarette curling blue drifts past his eyes, he traced again the course of the bullet that had so neatly stamped the finale on all of his adventures. There was no question that it had been fired from outside the window, and that also explained the peculiarly flat sound of the shot, which had faintly puzzled him. The cleavage lines and the few scrapes of glass remaining in the frame supplied the last detail of incontrovertible proof. He devoutly hoped that the shining lights of the local constabulary would have enough scientific knowledge to appreciate it. Mr. Oneynuts, having brilliantly performed his share of physical activity, appeared to have been snared again in the unfathomable quagmires of the mind. The tortured grimace that had cramped itself into his countenance indicated that some frightful eruption was taking place in the small core of grey matter which formed a sort of glutinous meadow inside his skull. He cleared his throat, producing a noise like a piece of sheet iron getting between the blades of a lawnmower, and gave the fruit of his travail to the world. "Boss," he said, "I don't know how these mugs think they can get away with it." How which mugs can think they can get away with what?" asked the saint somewhat vacantly. "These mugs," said Mr. Oneynuts. "They're trying to take us for a ride. They could tell me in the pub." Simon had stretched his memory backwards almost to breaking point to hook up again with Mr. Oneynuts' train of thought, and when he had finally done so, he decided that it was wise not to start any argument. "Others have made the same mistake," he said casually, and hoped that would be the end of it. Mr. Oneynuts nodded sagely. "I must leave you now. Hope you have a wonderful rest of the evening." "Oh, thank you, Malachi. Yes, you do the same. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And, I hope you have a wonderful, lovely weekend. And, yes, in case I don't see you, happy Halloween. Hope festivities are fun for you. Hope festivities are fun for all of you. Still deciding what to do for Halloween next week. Might do something here on stream. Not sure about that. I'll have to get back to all of you. "Well, they all get what's coming to 'em," he said with philosophic complacency. "When do I give this punk the walks?" "When do you what?" "This punk," said Mr. Oneynuts, waving his Betsy at the prisoner. "The mug who takes a shot at us." "You don't," said the saint shortly. The equivalent of what on anybody else's face would have been a slight frown carved its fearsome corrugations into Hoppy's brow. "You don't mean he gets away with it after all?" "We'll see about that." "Did you hear what he calls us?" "What was that?" "He calls us washouts." "Oh, that's too bad." "Yeah, that's too bad." Mr. Oneynuts glowered disparagingly at the captive. "Maybe I better go with him with a paddle first." just to make sure he doesn't go to sleep." "Leave him alone," said the saint soothingly. "He's young, but he'll grow up." He was watching the striped blazer with more attention than a chance onlooker would have realized. The young man stood glaring at them defiantly, not without fear, but that was easy to explain if one wanted to. His knuckles tensed up involuntarily from time to time, but a perfectly understandable anger would account for that. Once or twice he glanced at the strangely unreal shape of the dead girl half hidden in the shadows, and it was at those moments that Simon was studying him most intently. He saw the almost conventionalized horror of death that takes the place of practical thinking with those who have seen little of it, and a bitter disgust that might have had an equally conventional basis. Beyond that, the sullen scowl which disfigured the other's face steadily refused him the betraying evidence that might have made everything so much simpler. Simon blew placid, meditative smoke rings to pass the time, but there was an irking bafflement behind the cool patience of his eyes. It took 15 minutes by his watch for the police to come, which was less than he had expected. They arrived in the persons of a man with a waxed moustache, in plain clothes, and 2 constables in uniform. After them, breathless when she saw the striped blazer still inhabited by an apparently undamaged owner, came Rosemary Chase. In the background hovered a man who, even without his costume, could never have been mistaken for anything but a butler. Simon turned with a smile. "Glad to see you, Inspector," he said easily. "Just Sergeant," answered the plainclothes man, in a voice that sounded as if it should have been Sergeant Major. He saw the automatic that Mr. Unyats was still holding and stepped forward with a rather hollow but courageous belligerence. "Give me that gun," he said loudly. Hoppy ignored him and looked inquiringly at the only man whom he took orders from, but Simon nodded. He politely offered his own Luger as well. The sergeant took the 2 guns, squinted at them sapiently, and stuffed them into his side pockets. He looked relieved and rather clever. "I suppose you've got licenses for these firearms?" he said temptingly. "Of course," said the saint, in a voice of saccharine virtue. He produced certificate and permit to carry from his pocket. Hoppy did the same. The sergeant pored over the documents with surly suspicion for some time before he handed them to one of the constables to note down the particulars. He looked so much less clever that Simon had difficulty in keeping a straight face. It was as if the official mind, jumping firmly to a foregone conclusion, had spent the journey there developing an elegantly graduated approach to the obvious climax, and therefore found the entire structure staggering when the first step caved in under its feet. A certain awkwardness crowded itself into the scene. With a businesslike briskness that was only a trifle too elaborate, the sergeant went over to the body and brooded over it with portentous solemnity. He went down on his hands and knees to peer at the knife without touching it. He borrowed a flashlight from one of the constables to examine the floor around it. He roamed about the boathouse and frowned into dark corners. At intervals he cogitated. When he could think of nothing else to do, he came back and faced his audience with dogged valor. "Well," he said less aggressively, "while we're waiting for the doctor, I'd better take your statements." He turned. "You're Mr. Forrest, sir?" The young man in the striped blazer nodded. "Yes. I've already heard the young lady's story, but I'd like to hear your version." Forrest glanced quickly at the girl and almost hesitated. He said, "I was taking Miss Chase home, and we saw a light moving in here. We crept up to find out what it was, and one of these men fired a shot at us. I turned my torch on them and pretended I had a gun too, and they surrendered. We took their guns away, and then this man started arguing and trying to make out that somebody else had fired the shot, and he managed to distract my attention and get his gun back. Did you hear any noise as you were walking along? Sort of noise this deceased might have made as she was being attacked?" "No. I did not hear the noise of the deceased being attacked," repeated one of the constables with a notebook and pencil, laboriously writing it down. The sergeant waited for him to finish and turned to the saint. "Now, Mr. Templar," he said ominously, "do you wish to make a statement? It is my duty to warn you. Why?" asked the saint blandly. The sergeant did not seem to know the answer to that. He said gruffly, "What statement do you wish to make?" "Just what I told Comrade Forrest when we were arguing. Mr. Unyats and I were ambling around to work up a thirst, and we saw this door open. Being rather inquisitive and not having anything better to do, we just nosed in and we saw the body. We were just taking it in when somebody fired at us, and then Comrade Forrest turned on the spotlight and yelled 'hands up' or words to that effect. So to be on the safe side, we handed up, thinking he'd fired the first shot. Still, he looked kind of nervous when he had hold of my gun, so I took it away from him in case it went off. Then I told Miss Chase to go ahead and fetch you. Incidentally, as I tried to tell Comrade Forrest, I've discovered that we were both wrong about that shooting. Somebody else did it from the outside of the window. You can see for yourself if you take a look at the glass. The Saint's voice and manner were masterpieces of matter-of-fact veracity. It's often easy to tell the plain truth and be disbelieved, but Simon's pleasant imperturbability left the sergeant visibly nonplussed. He went and inspected the broken glass at some length, and then he came back and stretched his head. "Well," he admitted grudgingly, "there doesn't seem to be much doubt about that." "If you want any more proof," said the Saint nonchalantly, "you can take our guns apart. Comrade Forrest will tell you that we haven't done anything to them. You'll find the magazines full, the barrels cleaned." The sergeant adopted the suggestion with morbid eagerness, but he shrugged resignedly over the result. "That seems to be right," he said with stoic finality. "It looks as if both you gentlemen were mistaken," he went on, scrutinizing the Saint grimly. "But it still doesn't explain why you were in here with the deceased." "Because I found her," answered the Saint reasonably. "Somebody had to." The sergeant took another glum look around. He did not audibly acknowledge that all of his castles in the air had settled soggily back to earth, but the morose admission was implicit in the majestic stolidity with which he tried to keep anything that might have been interpreted as a confession out of his face. It took refuge in an air of busy inscrutability, as if he had just a little more up his sleeve than he was prepared to share with anyone else for the time being. But there was at least one member of his audience who was not deceived, and who breathed a sigh of relief at the lifting of what might have been a dangerous suspicion. "Better take down some more details," he said gruffly to the constable with the notebook, and turned to Rosemary Chase. "The deceased name is Nora Prescott, is that right, miss?" "Yes." "You knew her quite well?" "Of course. She was one of my father's personal secretaries," said the dark girl, and the Saint suddenly felt as if the last knot in the tangle had been untied. And that brings us to Chapter 5. I think we'll go ahead and leave it there. There's enough of a cliffhanger there that we can pick up next week. And I do believe we'll make this a regular thing on Friday of reading ASMR. So, with that brings us almost to the 2-hour mark. Let me go ahead and first put out the tip jar. You can support his lordship directly with a donation via Stream Elements. All of the links available at the website, lordrexworth.com. Again, lordrexworth.com. Join the Castle Rexworth Discord. The gates are open, and you can just click that link in chat to join the Castle Rexworth Discord if you haven't already. And then finally, got the throne page. Gifts always appreciated, but never required by his lordship. You can go to throne.com/Lord Rexworth, and then shop online, specially curated items by his lordship. Support me through purchases at the throne shop, lordrexworth.store. Again, lordrexworth.store. Let's go ahead and refresh and see. Oh my. False ID's running rather late this evening, isn't he? Might be midnight before we post an episode of Things VTubers Say. Now, let me see if I can find my fellow genmates. I know they're online. Let's see here. There we are. No, that can't be. Did he just get started? Yeah, it looks like Nobuyuki is getting started. I could have sworn, though, he was going to be taking part in the Among Us collab that's going on right now. Perhaps he just... That's interesting. Right. Then in that case, we will go and raid Resort. Thank you all so much for joining me tonight. I'll see you tomorrow. I will be taking part in the Among Us collab tomorrow night with the rest of Project Astadia. And then after that, we'll be taking part with Yozoru Ian and Pink Zombie in a collab with what's the name of this game again? It just escaped me. Streamer Brain. Horrible thing. Hang on. What is it called? Is it Deceit? I think it was Deceit. I had it on the tip of my tongue and then it left me. Yes, Deceit. Doing a Deceit collab with Pink Zombie and company. So, yeah, do watch out for that starting tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Right, we'll go raid Resort. Copy pasta. Can't forget about the copy pasta. Here we go. Right, Nobles. Copy and paste that. Thank you for streaming. Or should I be saying nay, thank you? Well, thank you, Kogani. That's very kind of you. All right. I'm Lord Rexworth, wishing you all the best, and God bless.